Thanks for returning to the banks of the Jordan River, where we're wading into some pretty deep waters, talking about division, animosity, and opposing viewpoints. If you haven't watched the previous two videos entitled Your Side and My Side, you might want to flip over to those so you're all caught up on those biblical stories from Numbers 32 and Joshua 22 that we've been unpacking. But as a quick review, as Israel prepares to cross the Jordan River to begin conquest of the Promised Land, they have unexpected victories on the east side of the Jordan, and the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half Manasseh get approval from Moses to make this territory their inheritance. They do cross over the Jordan, though, and faithfully fight with the western tribes until each of them is settled, and afterwards, they make their way back across the Jordan to their own homes. But before leaving, they build an altar on the western side to stand as a witness to their fears that the western tribes will someday cast them out, simply because the boundaries of the Jordan River run between them. So there's a fundamental difference of belief between the two groups about what makes someone a true Israelite. The western tribes would say that the true promised land is west of the Jordan, and living elsewhere, it just disqualifies you. The eastern tribes, however, assert that they are also true Israel because they proclaim and live lives that reflect that the Lord is their God. Which brings us back to this picture of the Jordan, with viewpoints on opposite sides and a river of animosity and mistrust flowing between them. I'd like to use this as a metaphor as we talk more about division. Do you see how it's tough to envision middle ground? With all that flowing water, you're not so sure where it exists, how deep you'll have to go. And that first step towards meeting in the middle is precarious. The water throws you off balance, and the rocks below are just slippery. It's a vulnerable first step, and it only gets more intense as you keep walking towards the middle. The slow and careful steps towards middle ground are hard, and you likely look ridiculous to those on the shore. That's why so few people attempt it. But can you and I, in this ancient West versus East argument, can we just attempt it? It seems like a good first move is to just consider that those on the other side aren't complete idiots. Though you may not agree with them, there might be good explanations for why they believe what they do. So if we first stand with the 2.5 eastern tribes and we look across the river towards the west at the brothers standing on that other shore, let's try to move towards them, to the middle, and consider what those Westerners might be thinking. Things like, throughout our entire lives, we've been without a home. We, like you, desperately want a homeland. But achieving that depends on our faithfulness to God's covenant. And we have seen the disaster that befalls all of us when we break covenant. So maybe it's best just to be extremely conservative about the bonds of the covenant. Now is not the time to push any limits. If the boundaries of the promised land aren't clearly outlined, then let's err on the side of caution. And doesn't Moses not being able to cross the Jordan to enter the promised land indicate that's where the border lies? Isn't that proof enough? And also, why can't you guys be satisfied with what God originally designated as your inheritance? It shows an extreme lack of gratitude to survey what you have been gifted and to say, that's not good enough for us. What's more, you living over there has you sharing land with Moabites and Edomites and Ammonites and others, with no definable line to separate who is who. Isn't the whole point of our nation to live distinctively to show God to the world? Do you have any idea how hard that's going to be if you intermix on the hillsides and in the valleys, since there's no barrier between you and the pagan nations? Pretty soon, you're going to adopt their practices and eventually their gods, and then we're all going to be cast out. Those are some pretty valid points, don't you think? And if the Easterners can stand in the middle for a minute, then maybe they can hear them. But this tentative dance, it takes two. So the West needs to move towards their Eastern brothers to hear things like, remember that we told you back in Numbers 32 that we're shepherds. We have herds and flocks. You're more about planting and harvesting crops. So by nature, boundaries are different for us. They're just more fluid. Your field, it won't move beyond whatever boundary you've set and planted stuff in, but our flocks have to move beyond any set boundaries just to find food to survive. Our experience and our basic needs make us see this differently than you. Your truth about boundaries It just doesn't work in a shepherding world. Now, we're not saying it's a false truth. It's just not true for us. And while it might look like we don't appreciate our original allotment of land, we see this unexpected land as indication that God might be working at something much bigger than we all initially assumed. Who are we to restrict God's vision to our more limited one? And besides that, are we really just supposed to abandon this territory? Nowhere has God expressly forbidden our living here, so why should you? And yes, while we will be living in closer proximity to pagan people, didn't God bless Abraham, and us, by the way, to be a blessing to the world? And what if part of blessing them entails living amongst them so that they can learn from us that the Lord is God? Now, the East also has some valid points, don't you think? If the Westerners can stand in the middle for a minute, then maybe they can hear. Now, notice that I'm not suggesting that either group abandon their side and cross fully over. What I'm advocating is that they attempt to truly hear the alternate view, to respect it, and not to dismiss it out of hand. I'm also not suggesting that anybody take up permanent residence in the river's middle. That's not the place where anybody lives. It is, however, the place where you willingly step off the solid ground of your own side to pursue understanding those on the other. So the Jordan River stands at the heart of the question, who gets to be Israel? Where the Western tribes say that it's about geographic boundary, and the 2.5 Eastern tribes say it's about faithfulness to Yahweh. Do you know what's so tragically ironic about how this story progresses? If we look into the first chapters of the book of Judges, we learn about what's happening with the Israelites in the generation just after Joshua and Phinehas and the other characters that we've been reading about. Joshua 2, verses 10 and 12 reads, "Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. And this resulted in a sad and steady degeneration of the people, such that you cannot believe the depths of the mess that they have become just 8 or so chapters later. It's truly tragic. And here's what I find ironic. All this arguing over who gets to be Israel seems to result in everybody taking their eye off the ball, leaving no one to actually be the faithful nation that God so desired to bless the world. Their infighting and mutual animosity fueled their downfall. They ended up forfeiting what they were so fiercely protecting from each other, their unique Israelite identity. Oh, but what if East and West could have ventured to meet each other in the middle just once in a while? Over time, each could have taken a rock from their side of the shore and placed it in the flowing water to step on. And pretty soon, you've got a path across. You've got a bridge of sorts, which can foster connection and relationship. And then, as future conflicts arose and pagan influences began to enter both communities, both East and West could hold each other accountable to faithfully follow the covenant laws that they had agreed to. Together, they could gather at the tabernacle at Shiloh on the Western Territory to worship and sacrifice. And together, they could frequently visit the stone altar built by the 2.5 Eastern tribes at Galiloth near the Jordan and remind themselves of the most central thing that made both sides Israelite. This thing that if they lose this, nothing else matters. For what's the name of this altar? A witness between us that the Lord is God. So that's my takeaway from the Jordan River. When I have taken a side, do I ever really look across to those opposite me, not to shout or deride, but to understand them? Do I ever find myself stepping towards them into the precarious water where I'm put off balance, not to get in their face, but to seek to appreciate their viewpoint? I can only hope that someone from over there will step out to meet me, but I can't ever expect it. All that I can do is to begin my own small movement. Because if history repeats itself, which it often does, the 12 tribes show us that if we can't ever come together to see what we share in common, we will most definitely together fall apart. So thanks for coming along on this short journey into the Bible text. I hope you've noticed something new in the landscape, or maybe even a fresh way to view territory that you've covered many times before. Whatever the case, it's good to have you along for the trip. You never know what we might discover as we crack open this fascinating text together.